Hello and welcome to Policy School. The Australia Institute's Policy School is coming back to you after a brief hiatus with Greg Jericho's bike injury. But we're very happy to be back today with Executive Director Richard Dennis and Strategic Director Leanne Minshull. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press, and I'm coming to you today from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And I would like to pay my respects to the people who have looked after this place for many, many millennia. So in Policy School, we've been talking about the key issues that you need to know in the current policy landscape, what the evidence-based research shows, what the barriers are to reforming policy, the most persuasive arguments and key messages, and how to communicate cut-through facts and use the data to help change minds. So at the end of Policy School, at the end of each episode, you'll have new information to confidently advocate for what needs to be done, explain why it needs to be done, and how we can all work together to achieve a more just, sustainable, and peaceful society. So some reminders, you can type in questions for our panelists in the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions if you particularly like someone's. You can talk to each other in the chat, and just a reminder, you can post questions at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. Remember to keep things civil, otherwise we'll kick you out of the chat. And finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available afterwards on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. So Richard and Leanne, you're going to be talking to us today about climate and the living standards crisis. Where shall we begin?
Oh, thanks, Alice. I'll kick off, and thanks, Alice, for kicking us off, and thanks, Leanne, for joining, and thanks everyone for coming along to listen to what I think is a really important conversation, because in Australia today, we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and that's because real wages haven't kept pace with prices. Let's never forget that the cost of living didn't fall from the sky. Wages got pushed down and prices got pushed up. Profits went up and people's real wages, people's disposable income have declined. So that's where we are. And I think today, and thanks, Leanne, for driving this, today's really important because I think a lot of people thinking about the election are like, well, in a cost of living crisis, we can't talk about climate change because rightly people think, well, most people's real problem that's front and center for them is the cost of living crisis. And showing up saying, well, why don't you spend $10,000 on a battery and, get yourself off the grid is not the most helpful thing you can say to people who are literally struggling to pay the rent or pay their mortgage or, live on an age pension with no super. So what we want to talk about today is how climate and the cost of living overlap. I just want to make a few quick points and then I'll hand over to Leanne to go through some, I think, quite helpful and important slides. But the first thing to know is that there's a real opportunity in talking about climate in a cost of living crisis because it doesn't matter whether people believe in climate change or not. It doesn't matter whether older voters believe in climate change or not. Their insurance company does and their supermarket does. So we're already seeing significant bills increasing because of climate change, not in decades or generations to come. Now, right now, the climate has already changed, and the changed climate is causing more storms and more damage and making insurance more expensive right now. That's happening. And it doesn't matter whether people believe in climate change, they know their insurance bill's gone up. And the same is true for lots of fresh food, and it's going to become more true in Australia and around the world. So climate change is here. The cost increases are here. This is not a, do we worry about the cost of living crisis today or climate change in the future? That's terrible framing. The fact is the cost of living crisis we're having right now is made worse. Now, what can we do about that? We're going to talk a bit about that today, but let's never forget that Australia is the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter. Saudi Arabia 1, Russia 2, plucky little Australia third biggest fossil fuel exporter in the world, aiming for number 2, trying to bump off those Russians. And more than half of the gas we export was given away for free, zero royalties. So if Australia wanted to deal with a cost of living crisis, how about we scrap $14 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies tomorrow, no problem. And start taxing all of the gas we export, no problem. These are politically popular. This is good economics. These possibilities exist. Labor don't want to talk about it. The coalition don't want to talk about it. We need to talk about it. So on that, I'll hand over to Leanne to put up some what we think is simple and helpful research.
Thanks, Richard. Hopefully people can see my slides now. Can you see them, Richard? Excellent.
I can.
Well, I'm just going to presume everyone can.
Yeah, all good, Leanne.
Excellent, thanks. And thanks everyone for coming along. Richard's right. The cost of living crisis the climate crisis is already fueling the cost of living crisis. And unfortunately, every day that we delay action on climate change is another, probably year that we bake in even higher prices for the things that we have to buy every day. And what I've done with this, we've done a lot of research about how climate change is affecting cost of living crisis, but I thought today I'd just take insurance and food. And I picked those two because they're pretty much non-discretionary spending as well. I mean, food's definitely non-discretionary, and insurance used to be, almost non-discretionary, but it's now getting to a point that it's so expensive that a lot of people can't afford it. So just here on the first slide, it shows payouts. I'm just going to try and see if I can move I can see my little boxes on my screen rather than the slides, and it's disconcerting. 1 second. Okay, I'll make do. So this shows you the estimated payouts from catastrophes. Everyone would be aware of the 2022 floods. That was a huge spike for Australian insurers to have to pay out on. I think what's almost more interesting as well, though, you can see that it varies from year to year, but it's on an upward trajectory, and that's not going to change. And it's expected to be around $35 billion worth of damage done by extreme weather events by the middle of the century. So it's a problem that's here, and it's not going to go away. Oh, sorry, my screen went, there we go. Sorry about this, guys.
There you go. That's the right one. Profit
Excellent.
and loss on general insurance.
Thank you, Richard. Well, there's been quite a lot of discussion around insurance companies just price gouging. I think that competition is always good. I don't think that the answer to this is solely in the opposition's proposal to break up the monopoly of insurers. There actually isn't the same type of monopoly that we have with Coles and Woolworths in the supermarkets. But even if we have more competition in the marketplace, it's actually not going to shift the underlying problem. The underlying problem with insurance is that it's really a conventional answer to a conventional problem. And climate change is a post-conventional problem that we can't fix with traditional models. And by that, I mean, we used to be able to have insure for unlikely events that would cause a lot of harm and spread the risk out across the community. With climate change, those events are becoming usual rather than unusual, and the profit that the insurance industry are getting are dropping. They're on a downward trajectory. And you can see here in 2022, the profits went back up. But you saw again in the last slide, or this next slide, sorry, this is what happened to your insurance premiums. So the insurance companies got a price hike, and that correlated, unsurprisingly, with the price hike in insurance premiums, which again came unsurprisingly from the major event we had in 2022, where the insurers took a hit.
Leanne, can you go back to the old slide? Is that hard?
Okay. Well, it shouldn't be, but
you've done it. No, I couldn't do it. You went back too far. Go forward.
All right, there we go.
Yeah. So just so everyone can see that, you can see that downward trend. You can see that in the early 2020s, the profits fell to record lows. That's because of the floods. And that surge that happened the next year was them retrospectively increasing prices to kind of make up for the losses that some of them made the year before. So Leanne's spot on, and to put it slightly differently, you can only insure against unlikely events. You can only insure against unlikely events. The minute something becomes likely, you can't insure against it. Insurance is just a bet. And you can bet the insurance company that you're going to crash your car this year. They'll take your money. They're betting you won't. You're happy when you don't crash your car. They're happy when you don't crash your car. Everyone's happy. But just like 18-year-olds can't hire cars because there's not an insurance company in the world that will insure an 18-year-old boy driving a car that's not their parents, because that's just too dangerous, you can't insure your way out of a climate crisis. The minute you live somewhere that's likely to be devastated by flood, the minute you live somewhere that's likely to be devastated by flood, the insurance companies are not going to insure you. They're not going to bet it's not going to flood when they know it will. So Leanne's spot on. The conventional approach is we're insuring against unlikely events. Climate change has made some events very likely, and we just need to all kind of flick the switch in our head that you can't insure your way out of a climate crisis. Sorry, Leanne.
No, that's good. That's very clear, Richard. And the insurance industry, a lot of people would have seen, put out a report with recommendations yesterday, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. The other thing I think that's interesting about this slide is that even with those massive increases in insurance premiums that we saw, it still doesn't get the insurance industry back up to the type of profits that they had, only 20 years ago. So this is the slide showing how our insurance premiums have gone up. And in fact, the Australia Institute did some research late last year, and we had a look at what some people are paying for insurance compared to their wages, their income. And we found that around 1 in 20 families are now working basically from New Year's Day till the end of February just to pay their insurance costs. So it's becoming really unsustainable for a lot of people, and lots of people are dropping out, and there are a lot of people who are underinsured. And there's also places in Australia now where we're having internal climate migration, where particularly in the northern rivers, northern Queensland and northwest Western Australia, that's a whole other topic that people might want to look into. But the message loud and clear is that the traditional models just aren't going to hold. So what do we do about it? There was an inquiry, government inquiry into the insurance industry in the wash up from the floods, no pun intended there, sorry. And they came up with some good reforms, and I think they actually came up with some good structural reforms. And I believe that we send these slides around, and that's why I've put in the links to the reports that people can go and have a look for themselves. But some of the recommendations, there was probably nearly 100. A lot of them concentrated on what individuals can do. I'm less interested in that because it's easy to shift the impost of climate change, which is a structural issue, back onto the individual. But the good recommendations to come out, I felt, was creating a nationwide adaptation plan. It's kind of hard to believe that we don't already have one. And then just yesterday, the Insurance Council of Australia came out with their federal election recommendations. Again, lots of focus on what individuals can do. Don't live in a dangerous spot, put sprinklers on your roof, all good things and all things that we can do. But they also had an ask for, I think it was $35 billion or $3.5 billion. I should know that, sorry, but I'm not sure where the dot point was, but it was a lot of money. And they want the government, rather than just have that ready for cleanup, they want the government to put that into actually, putting a fence at the top of the cliff, not just an ambulance at the bottom, and start doing some adaptation work, particularly in flood areas. Richard touched on this before. This wasn't part of the Insurance Council proposal, as far as I could see, but it should have been. One thing that we can do as a government or as a country, that we can just decide to stop subsidising fossil fuels. Last year it was $14.5 billion. So that would cover a lot of what the insurance companies are asking for, even in terms of adaptation. It could also go to a general reinsurance pool that the federal government is looking at. And that just means that they'll help people transition from where they're living. So not necessarily relocate, but they'll help people in high flood and high fire risk areas to both do some work on their houses to make themselves safer, which will also in turn bring down their insurance premiums, and then do some of that structural adaptation work that the country needs to do around flood levies and other other things.
Leanne, can I just jump in there just very quickly? It's really important to understand that $14 billion worth of subsidies, there's nothing hypothetical about this. The numbers come out of the budget papers. These numbers come from Treasury. And Economics 101 says subsidise things you want more of, tax things you want less of. Now, democracy gets to decide what we want more of and what we want less of, right? The economics textbook doesn't say what we should want more of. That's a democratic choice. That's not economics. So, you know, in Australia, we choose to subsidise the fossil fuel industry and charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. And in Norway, they choose to tax their fossil fuel industry and give their kids free higher education. That's why democracy matters. That's why choices matter. But the economics of this is thuddingly simple. If you wanted more fossil fuels and you wanted more fossil fuel use, you should subsidise them. Right? So when a government says they're doing everything we can to transition away from fossil fuels, and you say, well, how come you don't get rid of the subsidies then? Right, that's it, right? You've just called bullshit. It's as simple as that. So this is not hypothetical. This is just a lack of political will. We could do this. And as I said, we give half of our gas away for free to foreign-owned gas companies. We're a very generous people. We don't like foreign aid to poor countries. We love foreign aid to foreign fossil fuel companies. Again, if we got rid of the subsidies and we taxed gas, then this would be easy. One last point, just very quickly. The insurance industry knows this. They're not stupid. The insurance industry knows this. Why isn't this in their recommendations? Because the way corporate Australia works, the finance sector doesn't want to have a fight with the fossil fuel sector. Right? So the insurance companies are out there talking about half of it. We need a levy. We need a levy. We need a plan. We need a plan. We need an adaptation budget. We need to spend money on adaptation. They know the money's got to come from somewhere. The insurance companies know it should come from the fossil fuel industry, but that's not Australia. That's not how we work. So class solidarity at the top end of town means that it falls to us, people on this call, to make this simple point. The economics are simple, the politics are simple, but corporate Australia doesn't attack corporate Australia.
Well, I agree with that almost, Richard, because I think, yeah, lucky we're in separate rooms. Because that is how it's happened, and I think we're starting to see cracks. So I had a quick look through the report that the Insurance Council put out, and I couldn't find anything there around things like stop subsidising fossil fuels, but they are starting to use words like bring down emissions. They are starting to talk about the need to not expand our fossil fuel sector anymore. There are people splitting off in lots of ways. So whereas it used to be like this, I feel like it's a bit like that now. So yay us. That didn't happen because corporate Australia woke up and thought, I think we should do the right thing here. There's some good solutions. That's because the Australia Institute, all the people on this call, and people across Australia have been calling for it. So I think there's a little bit of hope there that the class solidarity is starting to break apart a bit. The next point is that we could implement a disaster levy on gas and coal exports. It's a revenue raising policy that's been put forward for, probably a couple of decades now by the Australia Institute and a lot of other people. And it's also gaining traction internationally. And we're also going to start looking at, we spend a lot of time listening to Trump talk about, he's going to put import tariffs on aluminium and everything else so it can be US made. The EU and lots of other countries are already looking at putting tariffs on products that come from countries that aren't dealing with their fossil fuel expansion. So I think that's also fertile ground. I think, even 5 years ago, the proposal to implement a disaster levy on gas and coal exports would have, it's quite not laughed at, but not taken seriously. But I think it's being taken really seriously now, and it's something that we should continue to advocate for. So I thought next we'd have a look at food an absolutely non-discretionary item that we all have to spend our money on. The price of food tracks a lot more closely with how the overall prices rise. So that blue line along there is rise in overall prices. The orange one is food. And you can see that something that everyone's probably used to, even before we started to have climate impacts on our food system, is that we'd get an extreme weather event like Cyclone Larry or Cyclone Yasi, and certain foods would spike and we wouldn't be able to get them. But it wasn't, in a lot of ways, it wasn't that bad. I can remember, for 6 months you had to pay $10 for a banana, but that's fine, just buy something else and the price would come back down. What's happening now is a far more fundamental undermining of the global food ecosystem. And that's why you can see the price of food steadily rising. And more importantly, I think, if we just go to the next slide, we've done a little study on the price of oil. So anyone who loves olive oil will understand it's gone from about $7 for half a litre in, or the 250 mils in the supermarkets, to like $20 or something now. And this was because there's been a lot of droughts in Spain, in the regions where olive oil is predominantly grown. The drought has been longer and deeper than any of the previous droughts. A lot of people for the first 12 months of the drought were saying this is going to impact prices, and then the prices will come back to what they used to be. But what's happening is that the climate is changing so much that it really is fundamentally undermining the ecosystem that supports that crop. So people are now recognising that in the case of olive oil, for example, that it will never get back to the type of output that you could get in Spain for olive oil. And the prices probably won't drop. They might drop a bit, but they'll never get back to the prices, that we were used to once upon a time. And that the worrying thing for cost of living pressures is that that's just an example of olive oil. As different climate impacts hit different sectors and different parts of the landscape, we're going to find real variation in food prices other than olive oil, and the inability to get some staples that we're just very used to here in Australia. So when I put this slide together, I actually emailed Richard and said, I don't even have recommendations from this. I went and tried to find out what we do about addressing climate change fueling the cost of food. And Richard told me it's simple. We just have to eat more lentils. So that
wasn't for public consumption.
Oh, sorry, Richard. Well, you're going to have to be careful. That's the end of the slides. Richard, do you have any other than we've got to eat more lentils, thoughts that you can share around the types of things that we can do to remediate some of the problems around food price increases?
Yes, and by the way, lentils are good. I encourage them. I guess where I'd start is that the fact that catastrophic climate change is happening is a terrible thing. Let me be clear, I know that. But it would be an even more terrible thing if people were afraid to talk about it in the lead up to an election because there's a cost of living crisis. So what we're trying to do today is not bright side things, but give you opportunities to say to voters, to say to other people, to say to people seeking office, candidates, that look, here's what the research says is going on already. This is not an abstract future versus a very real present. And similarly, that with things like food price increases, Leanne's right. Like, if you take the climate science seriously, which obviously we do at the Australia Institute, we know that agricultural production is going to be significantly diminished in some parts of the world. We know this. And we also know that things like floods destroy infrastructure that make it harder to get perfectly good food from where it is to where we live before it rots. So this is going to happen. And that's bad and that's scary. And in Australia, let's be clear, we don't sort of eat very efficiently. And, I eat meat. I was a vegetarian for many years. I eat meat. But meat is a very, very inefficient way to get sort of nutrition into a human body. What we do is we feed huge amounts of food to animals to turn it into small amounts of food that we then come and eat. So please don't hear me saying, get out there and tell everyone the solution to climate change is to become vegetarian. Become vegetarian if you want. But back to Leanne's point about bananas. What happened when the price of bananas went through the roof is, not surprisingly, people changed their eating patterns. They didn't stick bananas in their kids' lunch boxes, because why would you pay that much for a banana for your kid to eat when you can give them an apple? So inbuilt into an economy, inbuilt into a society as we adapt to change, well, as food becomes more expensive, full stop, which it will, full stop, we're going to see change in consumption patterns of food. And some of that is going to be bad or inconvenient, and some of that's actually going to be quite good for our health. And again, thinking about election, we have to be very careful telling low-income Australians, oh, well, you just need to change your diet and everything will be fine. But planning ahead over decades, we need to understand that Australians didn't eat the kind of food we eat today 30 years ago. Our diets have changed radically. So guess what? In 20 or 30 years' time, our diets are going to change again. And part of that's going to be climate change, and part of that's going to be the price increases that come with climate change. But, you know, as long as people have got access to enough nutritious food, which nutritious food is a smaller issue. So yeah, thanks for dumping me in the mung beans and lentils, Leanne. But it actually is, no, it's fine. It's a really interesting and important thing. But if we're trying to get people to care about climate change and think about what we can do, personally, I would dissuade people on this call from leading with the lentils. I don't think that's the place to start, but it is part of it. And if push comes to shove, Australians ate more lentils and less red meat, well, most of your nutritionists would tell you that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But to be clear, climate change is a bad thing.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, yeah, sorry, Richard, I possibly shouldn't have shared that private joke, because I also would encourage people not to lead with that. But I think what it does show, though, is that also, you know, whether it's making your house more climate resilient or changing your energy choices, or, you know, putting a new light bulb in, quite often corporate Australia will push us into make better personal choices. And it's not about making better personal choices. That's a good thing to do, and we can all do that. But food systems as well have to be looked at from a much more holistic perspective. And we've got to look at how we change the emissions profile of food. And I think that it is something that is quite often left out. It's a growing conversation, but it's also left out a little bit from the broader climate change conversation a lot of the time. And, you know, we're getting to the point where we can't afford to keep doing that.
And also their political strategy, the political strategy of the people who make billions of dollars a year in subsidized fossil fuel production, their political strategy is to make us feel guilty for not doing enough, to make us feel divided as to is it lentils or isn't it, when actually we just need to unite around, look, I'll eat lentils if I feel like it, but how about I stop giving you $15 billion a year in subsidies, and how about we stop approving your new coal and gas, and you can keep your cheap advice about my diet to yourself. I'll take that from my nutritionist, thanks. But, you know, fossil fuel companies, you know, you can F right off with your advice about what I eat. How about we talk about what you do with my public money?
I know that Alice wants to wind us up now, but one last point that came out at our Climate Integrity Summit a couple of weeks ago, that I didn't know this, but the whole term carbon footprint came from an oil company. It came from Shell. That was their strategy to push everybody into thinking that they were absolutely 100% personally responsible for climate change. Sorry, Alice.
That's all right. There's quite a bit of discussion in the chat and in the Q&A box about fossil fuel subsidies and those kinds of questions. And I can recommend, for example, we did a policy school with Research Director Rod Campbell. So have a look at that one, and also come along next time when we have Rod speaking about approving new coal mines. Let's turn to the other questions now. So we have a question from Rebecca Sharp who asks, would a nationwide mandate for local councils to implement a local disaster risk reduction plan that aligns to the UN's 10 essentials for making cities resilient assist with minimising the increase in insurance premiums?
Yeah, I might start on that one. The short answer is yes, it can. It's not yes, it would, but yes, it can. So if it's done well, and it's done in conjunction actually with the insurance industry, I think that it can work well. And in fact, there's lots of examples now overseas where councils have been sued by property holders for not adequately maintaining drains and fire breaks, particularly in the US. So it's something that councils are going to have to start to address, even from a risk perspective, let alone a mitigation perspective.
Look, I agree, and I think it highlights a really important point that in one level, tackling climate change is really quite simple. We need to stop doing bad things and do a lot more good things. We need to tax the things that are causing harm and subsidise the things that are doing good, and then we need a democratic conversation about which is which. But implementing it is harder than often people think, and my only concern with the question is not would that help, but who's going to resource local councils to do that? So, you know, we live in a country where population policy is set at the national level. The ability for a local council to set rates is typically governed by state government legislation, but local governments have to implement a very wide range of policies. And, you know, when they do it, where's the money going to come from? So, yep, all for saying to local councils, you know, please do these good things. But we need to think about, well, are we going to let councils increase their rates? Do we want councils to have less libraries? You know, what's going to give? I would say get rid of the subsidies and stop giving away free gas, but I'm old-fashioned like that. But we can't just say, here's more work for councils to do. Good luck with that.
Yeah, it 100% has to be funded. And I think some of the recommendations coming out are looking at that. No one's saying get it from gas or coal, you're right. Absolutely. But the money has to come from somewhere. It's not going to be the ratepayers. And that's why a national adaptation plan is really essential.
We have a question from Chris Yates. Insurance is a housing cost, so is construction. Is it possible to combine sustainable composite materials and prefab to reduce emissions and reduce costs via less waste?
Oh, maybe. But, you know, I don't think we have to join those issues. I think we should design our buildings as best we can. We should have all sorts of policies in place to reduce the emission intensity of all sorts of materials. I think reducing the emissions associated with building things is good, full stop, all by itself. We should do that. Insurance is far more to do with where your house is than what it's made out of. And if I build the safest, most sustainable house on a floodplain and we keep subsidizing fossil fuel expansion, my house is going to get inundated on a regular basis. And is that a me problem? Is that something I can insure my way out of? Or is that a national problem that we're all going to have to grapple with? So when a fire destroys a whole bunch of houses, we usually step in and think, wow, look at all the poor people that lost everything there. How can we help? Well, that generosity comes from the fact that fires like that are rare. All the science says more floods, bigger, more often, more fires, bigger, more often. The real scary thing is at some point as a society, we're going to retreat back into, sorry, mate, can't help you with your burnt down house. I'm worried about mine. So, yep, we should do everything we can to make buildings lower emission and more efficient. And we should be looking at the risks for insurance. We can combine them if we want, but we don't have to.
We have a question from Terence Hull asking for a comment on the potential for a Ken Henry-style tax reforms to be designed to more effectively address climate change issues in agriculture, industry, and services. What do you think?
Oh, I'm busting to go, but Leanne, do you want to go
No,
first?
no, I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to talk first. I'm going to hand this over to the economist, and then I'll pick some holes in your arguments.
Oh, well, I wish you luck. Oh, no, climate change is far too important to have a Ken Henry style tax reform agenda that achieved nothing. Like, what's the lesson out of the Henry Tax Review? We didn't implement any of it. Like, it's one of the worst bits of policy development in Australian history. Now, you know, that's not a knock on Ken Henry as a person. I get on well with him, but the blueprint we need is not the tax reform agenda that achieved none of the recommendations of any significance. What we need is a simple, I'm choosing my words carefully here, a simple reform agenda that is politically popular and easy to implement. We do not need anyone to come and write a 1,000-page report with 400 recommendations, none of which, by the way, none of which in the Henry Tax Review was stop subsidising fossil fuels. So get over the past. It didn't help. This is not a new problem. These are not new ideas. Calling climate change a wicked problem is part of the problem. It's like we're blaming the problem. Oh, that naughty problem of climate change is misbehaving again. No, the fossil fuel industry is misbehaving. Right? So, no, we need something far more important and far more effective than a big Henry-type tax review. We need to simply ask questions like, well, what do we want more of? What do we want less of? What are we taxing? What are we subsidising? We should absolutely look at the way we support agriculture in Australia. We're going to need the agriculture industry to cope with change. We should get rid of the diesel fuel rebate and find new ways to help farmers. But also we should get rid of those subsidies, charge money for gas. There's money laying on the table, and we should be putting that money into our built environment, into our agriculture sector. And we need to be doing this now. And we do not need a very big, very complicated thing with 100 recommendations, because that didn't work, no matter how proud people are of the high point of the tax debate in Australia. That tax debate led to nothing. But I'll tell you what got up was the stage 3 tax cuts, which weren't even in there.
All right, I think that's a really good answer. I'm not even going to try to pick holes in that. I'm actually going to back it in, because it's almost like you should write a book on econobabble, Richard. But it's, I think one of the tricks that corporations and some politicians use is that they may take a really simple thing, stop fossil fuels, tax fossil fuels more, and they make it really opaque. And one of the best and confusing. And one of the best ways to do that is to have an inquiry with hundreds of recommendations, and it builds this kind of false legitimacy to it that because we've got 100 recommendations and because it took 8 months, this is the Bible, and it's just, we don't have time. And Richard's right, it doesn't work. It's really simple. We just have to push for, stop the expansion of fossil fuels, full stop. Stop the subsidies tomorrow.
We have a question from Julianne Tice, who is interested in your thoughts on schemes to improve the resilience of homes to floods that exist in New South Wales and Queensland. Is improving the resilience of individual homes one by one a genuine part of the solution to protect homes in climate hazardous areas? And if so, can these schemes be applied to bushfire emergencies as well?
Well, I might go first on that one. I think it is part of the problem. I think it can be part of the solution, as long as it's not promoted as the most important part of the solution. And importantly, if people who have bought houses and live there in good faith, because our planning systems have allowed these developments to go ahead in places they never should. I remember working 25 years ago with the New South Wales government doing mapping for sea level rise, and the recommendation that was a part of lots of recommendations to councils to draw a map and not to allow developments to go ahead got lost. The developments went ahead. Now, people have invested in those areas in good faith, and if they can do some remediation work that helps them survive the next flood or fire, I think that's a good thing. But the discussion is also, it can't be at the expense of the more structural reforms, and the discussion also needs to be, should we have some sort of national scheme that helps those people to do that? And that is a very live discussion. But again, it's a discussion that needs to actually be money on the table. The next step after that, which I noted earlier, is that we're now actually at the point where some houses just can't have, be fixed to make it more bushfire or flood resilient. And and people are actually having their houses bought back and relocating. It's about, I think it's around 20,000 people a year now are relocated, and we're about to see climate change really, it's on a trajectory like that. So I don't know how many houses we'll be talking about by 2030. Or if you think about it another way, 2030 is only 5 years away. Sometimes when I say 2030, it's like, oh, way off in the distance. It's 5 years.
Yeah. Look, I agree with what Leanne said. I just caution people about falling into the classic neoliberal trap of divide and conquer. And that is, let's get households and communities fighting with each other about what the sort of local scheme for helping you flood-proof your house is. And while we're all fighting about how to flood-proof your house, no one's actually reminding people that if that new coal mine goes ahead and those subsidies get paid, we're all stuffed on that floodplain. Yeah. So they're not mutually exclusive, and I'm not suggesting the questioners thinks they are mutually exclusive, but political capital is finite. And if we put too much political capital into the small local solution for a person, that's a giant win for the people who are getting subsidized to cause the problem. So this is where policy gets hard, is when well-meaning people who share values and goals are disagreeing about what scale should we intervene in here. And I hate to tell you, the fossil fuel industry hopes we all intervene at the local level and all intervene at the household level, because if we're all busy doing that, then they're safe to keep expanding with our subsidies.
I think one way to pull those two things together is to look at what type of, so there are tools now for bushfire resilience and what you can do to your house. If we looked at that at a much higher scale, because I agree with you, Richard, it can't be at the expense of structural change, and you have a limited amount of political capital, but there's nothing to stop us from attaching the need for that to be paid for by other people other than householders, and let's tax the fossil fuel industry to get that done. I think any ways that we can actually kind of personalise the fact that we need to get money from the fossil fuel industry to help us fix the problem that they've created is a good thing.
Yep.
I wasn't going to ask this question because it seemed as though it was a little bit to the side of what we were talking about, but both that lead in and the fact that it's had 8 thumbs up indicates I reckon I should ask it now. From Chris Barry, what income does Australia get from gas and coal exports, and who benefits?
Good question, and we'll put the answer to the decimal place in the link afterwards. But there's 2 ways to understand income that are really important. So a lot of people think that somehow export income is my income or our income, and it's not. Like, let me be clear. If I go into the shirt making business and I export $1 billion worth of shirts, they're my shirts and that's my $1 billion. That's not yours. What the gas industry's done, the foreign-owned gas industry in Australia is overwhelmingly foreign-owned. They've kind of told Australians, look at all your gas that you gave us for free that we exported and made huge profits on. You're welcome. I gave you exports. It's like, oh, okay, wacko. What do I do with your profit that came from you exporting the gas I gave you for free? So when we calculate gross domestic product, when we calculate GDP, yep, all those exports are included in Australia's gross domestic product. But the profits literally go to the people who own the company. If I own the shirt company, the export profits are mine. And if a Japanese gas company gets our gas for free and sells it overseas at a big profit, that profit counts in our GDP. The exports count in our GDP, but the money goes to the Japanese owners. So as a percentage of all the tax collected in Australia, federal, state, and local, the revenue we're getting from fossil fuels is just a small percentage. Again, we'll put the correct number in the thing. I don't want to mislead anyone today. And unlike Barnaby Joyce, if I get things wrong, it haunts me forever. Other people make shit up and they get away with it every day. So we'll put the right number in there, but it's a really small percentage of government revenue in Australia, and it's government revenue that we spend on schools. It's government revenue we spend on hospitals. It's government revenue that we'll spend on adaptation. Export revenue, using my economics words carefully, export revenue is not really a thing that matters, right? It's in the accounts, but you and I don't get a say over what to do with export revenue. That goes to the foreign companies that we gave the gas to for free.
It's almost like the clues in the title, export.
Yeah.
I actually hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, it is pretty simple when you think about it like that.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions about how these foreign-owned fossil fuel companies would react if government subsidies were stopped, or if suddenly taxation or PRRT were applied. What do you think would happen, Richard?
Oh, they'll react angrily. We know this because it's happened a few times. The former state Labor government in Queensland, the Miles Labor government, increased coal royalties in the lead up to the last election and said, hey, we're going to increase how much the taxpayers get from those coal exports, right? So the coal was getting exported, and the Japanese coal companies thought that was great. And then Stephen Miles said, well, we're going to make you pay more for the coal we give you, and we're going to spend billions of extra dollars on public housing and infrastructure. And Stephen Miles did a lot better at the last election than people expected. But the Japanese ambassador to Australia, in a very undiplomatic language, was ripping into Australia. The CEO of a number of Japanese coal and gas companies have been very vocal in Australia. We've even been told, again, we'll put this in the links afterwards, by the CEO of a Japanese gas company that if we don't approve all of their gas export expansion plans, if we start taxing them, then we'll actually be, creating, strategic and national security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Like, this is just what economists call bullshit. I mean, just to be clear, choosing my words carefully here, going to pop this in the slides later, always put your references up. Japan exports more gas than Australia exports to Japan. And I hate to break it to you, Japan doesn't have any gas of its own, right? Japan is exporting more gas to Korea and China and Bangladesh and Vietnam and other places. And Japan is exporting more gas than we sell to them. But we've been told it'll be lights out in Tokyo if we don't say yes to every new gas proposal. So yeah, it's crazy stuff. But frankly, how do smokers feel when we increase the tax on cigarettes? Sad. How do beer drinkers feel when we increase the tax on beer? Sad. How does the gas industry feel when we increase the tax on gas? Sad. Well, suck it up.
I think one of the more interesting responses I've heard too is that people are worried that if we tax the resources industry more, they'll go elsewhere. Like, okay, are you going to go to Japan to mine Australian coal? And then if we take that even further, like, that's not such a bad thing. When you look at what we pay in subsidies, when you look at what the export revenue is, so not our revenue, the end game here is to actually stop the expansion of fossil fuels if we want to survive. So if these people want to stop their expansion because we won't pay them to do it, ripper.
Yeah, winning. I mean, it's got to be right. It's got to be the weakest threat in the history of politics.
Yeah.
If you put a tax on me, I'll stop doing the thing you wanted me to stop.
That you want us to stop. Woohoo!
Okay, I'm sold at that price.
I think, but we do have 200 plus years of colonial extractivism running through our blood. It's a cultural threat way more than an economic or reality threat.
Yeah, and that's why we're shoveling money. Albanese government just gave $30 million to prop up the foreign-owned salmon industry in Tasmania. It's why the New South Wales government subsidises native forest logging. So you're spot on. This is not just a fossil fuel thing. This is a way the Australian governing class have rolled for centuries. You know, we subsidise the extraction of scarce resources, whether it's whales or asbestos, which we did get rid of, or logging and salmon and coal and gas today. It's not a new phenomena, and it's harder than show someone the evidence and they'll change their mind.
So for our last question, I'm going to put two together. The first half is, how do the people listening on this call speak to people that they know who are really resistant to some of this information and some of this data? What kinds of conversations can they have to convince them? And then the related point from Meg Moller is, how does the public leverage the two major political parties to stop subsidising fossil fuels when they are handcuffed to fossil fuels and other big corporations?
I'll start on the first one. So look, everyone speaks to people in different ways, and your audience always changes as well. I don't think that you can underestimate the power of talking one-on-one or, you know, like small conversations to your community. They're really, really important, and they actually are. When you really start to see change happen, that's when you see the conversations happening almost spontaneously. So I don't have a real script or a key point on how you talk to people, but I will say, because other than working for the Australia Institute, I've been a publican for 7 years. I've just finished. My husband's still a publican. And the conversations that we had in Tasmania to people who worked, a lot of them worked in extractive industries, if we could personalise it or bring it to something that they understood that affected their life and then broaden the conversation out from there, the conversations always went really well. So just going back to the olive oil example, over over a 12-month period, the oil that we had to put in the chipper went up by 400%. So people's hot chips all over the state went from $7 to $10. And then you could start talking about the oil, and you could actually start having a conversation about why climate change has put up the cost of that oil. And then people would be much more open, because it's starting at something that they care about and that they know about. Every conversation that I've ever had that started with climate up the front, unless the person's already interested, they won't walk along the hallway with you into the lounge room. They'll just turn around and leave the door. That's my tip for how to start conversations with people.
Look, I agree with Leanne, and conversations matter. All sorts of things matter. And as I said at our Climate Integrity Summit a few weeks ago, if protest was impotent, if protest didn't matter, then why do they work so hard to ban and fine people for doing it? Conversations matter, participation in public debate matters, writing letters to the editor matters, calling radio stations matters, going to protests that you believe in matter. And as citizens, we've been told for a long time, you can't do it. You'll never beat those big corporates. But you know what the big corporates can't do is vote. That's why they're getting nervous, because ultimately they can spend a lot of money, but they can't vote, and everyone on this call can. So in terms of talking about climate change, well, you know, talk about it as if it's already happening, because it is, and it's already having impacts because it is. And remind people that whether they believe in climate change or not, their insurer does and their supermarket does. So, you know, what are we going to do about it? And don't take the bait when people are trolling you. Just be really careful not to take that up. And the right is so good at trolling. You know, they don't like renewables because they kill birds and they kill koalas, but they like native forest logging, even though it kills birds and kills koalas. They want to be on the farmer's side if a farmer's concerned about wires going across their land. But when the farmer says, don't frack my land, they say, no, not listening to you. You know, they're worried about whales with offshore wind because, you know, all of a sudden the right cares about whales, except when you say, well, seismic blasting, exploring for new oil is deafening and killing whales. Oh, that's not right. So they're having fun. I hate to break your hearts here. They're having fun. They're taking the piss. Right? They know what they're doing, and they often distract us into these fake fights, like a fake fight about nuclear power stations that won't get built. We just need to kind of stay calm and talk to the sensible centre, talk to the middle, because if you get stuck having a fight with the mad uncle, the people in the middle think you're a bit mad too.
You know what? Add one more thing. We did some internal message testing a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that came back that was kind of no surprise, but a surprise at the same time, was that we looked at some of the biggest policy issues in the public debate and then asked people if they'd heard about them, and the amount of people who hadn't heard about them was like phenomenal. One of the things people had heard about was increases to the pay rates of people who worked in aged care centres. And I think it sort of reinforces my point that if you start a discussion with somebody about something that affects them, affects one of their family members, or they know, then they're far more interested in the policy. And the good thing and the bad thing about climate is that climate is impacting us right now, so people will listen to it, and it is impacting cost of living. And of course, the bad thing about that is that we're suffering the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and also, sorry, Alice, just very quickly, left-wing voters, right-wing voters, centrist voters, call people what you want. No one thinks giving gas away for free is a good idea, right? It's the major parties might both want to do it because that avoids a fight with the powerful fossil fuel industry. But voters, however you want to categorize them, whether they're one nation nationalists, or deep green, rapid decarbonizationists, they all agree we shouldn't be giving the gas away for free. And again, but how come the gas industry keeps winning? Because they get us to fight each other about why, rather than unite around what. So, if you're talking to the mad uncle who loves causing climate change and thinks it'll increase plant growth, well, I reckon they'll still agree that we should be making the gas industry pay some more tax.
Good point.
Lots of applauding hands for that one, Richard. Excellent point. Thank you so much, Richard and Leanne, for your policy school session today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this has been recorded, so if you want to share it with your friends, family, loved ones, even your mad uncle, you'll be able to afterwards. And I'll be sure to include those notes that Richard had, and the PowerPoint slides will be available on our website as well. We look forward to welcoming you along next time on the 13th of March, when we have Rod Campbell, our research director, talking about No New Coal Mines, a policy, not a slogan. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube. You can catch all of our webinars and all of our previous Policy School episodes. You can subscribe to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts after America, and follow the money, also dollars and cents. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can email us, mail@australiainstitute.org.au. Please put Policy School in the subject. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.